Me da mucho gusto presentar al profesor Angus Dawson, quien es presidente de la Asociación Internacional de Bioética, y gusto reconocer su trayectoria en la bioética y desde luego en actividades que para la Comisión Nacional de Bioética son de suma importancia, toda vez de que los campos recientes que él ha venido desarrollando son justamente los que a nuestro país tienen una proyección muy importante. Es el caso de la bioética y la salud pública. Desde esta perspectiva no podría dejar yo de agradecerle al profesor Angus que esté acá con nosotros en nuestro país. Desde luego él viene para revisar, asesorar los trabajos preparativos y desde luego para el lanzamiento de lo que serán los eventos del 2014 en nuestro país. Me refiero a la Cumbre Global de Condiciones Nacionales de Bioética y desde luego también al 12º Congreso Mundial de Bioética. Pero con su amabilidad y siempre disposición a la enseñanza, recordemos que es profesor de la Universidad de Birmingham, en donde también es jefe del Departamento de Medicina, Ética, Filosofía, Historia y Medicina. Quizás el nombre correcto lo precisará él, y desde luego mi intervención será breve, puesto que será más importante escuchar sus conceptos sobre el tema que habrá de desarrollar. Profesor Angus, bienvenido y qué gusto nos da verle en la Ciudad de México. Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Muchas gracias. Well, thank you very much to Manuel and everybody here at the Commission. I've just been in Mexico for a few days and I've had a fantastic time. The hospitality has been amazing. So today I'm going to be talking about public health ethics, but what I'd like to do is to frame that in terms of a discussion of obesity. So you'll see, I hope later on, why I've done that. So this is an argument that's going on in the area of public health ethics, and I want to argue that most of the people that work in the area of public health ethics are still thinking in terms of what I would call a narrow approach, which is something derived from bioethics. And I'll explain what I mean by that, and then contrast it with my own preferred account, which I call a substantive account of public health ethics. So the structure of the talk is, as I mentioned, I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by minimal public health ethics, and then explain why we might think about public health and public health ethics in a more substantive way. So the minimal approach, I think, is influenced by a number of features, and one of them is the history of medical ethics. So here there are many issues that we could look at, of course, in the history, but bioethics has tended to focus upon medical ethics historically. That's where it originated from about 40 years ago, mainly in the United States. And the focus right from the start was upon thinking about the relationship between physicians and patients, so about individual relationships. So lots of the discussion about consent and confidentiality, those issues relate to the relationship between two individuals, the doctor and the patient. Secondly, historically there's been a tendency to focus on particular issues which have been paradigms for thinking about medical ethics, and when we teach introductory medical ethics, I'm sure it's the same with those of you that teach as well, we tend to focus on these issues like abortion and euthanasia, which we can talk about in terms of, again, individual decisions. Should I have an abortion or not? really biologically possible, but should I be involved in decisions about abortion or not? Should I be involved in thinking about decisions to do with euthanasia? The idea is that on this tradition, in this history, it's for an individual to make that decision. And lastly, there's been a tendency to focus upon the latest high technology. So you could almost do bioethics by keeping copies of Science and Nature by your bed, finding out what the latest technological issue in medicine is that month, and then writing a paper about it. So there's this particular focus that the history of medical ethics has had. Secondly, I think a lot of medical ethics has tended to look towards the law for some of its concepts, or there has been a confusion between ethics and law. Now the two are related, of course, but I would argue that law and ethics are distinct. Laws are the products of a national or an international body and are binding upon everybody. Ethics is more flexible. It's more about thinking about what is right. We might have some individual disagreements about that. But the law, certainly in the legal systems that I know, I must admit I know nothing at all about the law in Mexico, but in the legal systems I know, there's been a tendency in discussions about medical ethics to use these kinds of concepts. So ideas about protecting property, thinking about the body as being a type of property, thinking about the products of the body as also being property. And all of this comes from a certain kind of conception of thinking about the law in terms of rights, ownership, control, and there are particular kinds of legal constructs that you see influencing people when they work in this area. And the third element to this minimal approach is this focus on the role of liberty. So this idea that we have to be concerned about the state as being an instrument of paternalism, about making decisions on our behalf, and not allowing the space for us as individuals to make our own choices. And there's a particular notion of liberty at work here, is liberty as non-interference. So it's your right to be free to make whatever choices you want without the interference of other individuals or the state. And the way that this is often constructed is in terms of this presumption in favour of liberty. So, as many of you will be familiar with, we can think about these ideas as deriving from John Stuart Mill's work. There's some dispute about the extent to which Mill's views are actually genuinely reflected in this particular view. I myself would argue that this tradition just bases itself upon one paragraph in the essay on liberty, rather than taking Mill's whole view into account. I think Mill has far more of a careful and nuanced account of how liberty fits in with other values and concepts than many of his supporters seem to think. So this tradition, and why there are inverted commas around million, is, we'll leave it open whether this is actually Mill's view, but the Millian tradition tends to focus on this idea about respecting individual autonomy. So when I give talks, when I talk to people about medical ethics, when I hear other people talking about medical ethics, the tendency is to, if you talk in terms of the four principles, it will be autonomy that's mentioned first. Or if you are not talking in terms of the four principles, you will hear autonomy being the first concept or the dominant concept in a lot of people's talks. Certainly, if you come to the Congress next June, which I hope you all will, you will hear lots of people talking about autonomy. And on this view, if we think about health promotion, so let's assume that we think it's a problem that in Mexico you have the second highest rates of obesity in the world, then on this view, the preferences that you have to eat the food that you want, they are your own business. And it's not for the state, it's not for other individuals, it's not for health promoters or people who work in public health to interfere in those choices. The most that they can do is perhaps provide you with information about what kinds of foods are unhealthy, what kinds of lifestyle you could adopt that would improve your health. Anything else on this tradition can be held to be paternalism, and because it's paternalism, it's therefore wrong. Now again, we could have a debate about what paternalism is. I think it's a more complicated story than that, but this is the million tradition that you will see really dominant in a lot of bioethics. So one way we could think about health promotion and public health is just to accept that this is the way that we ought to think about it. Let's just use the tradition of bioethics, which is the dominant tradition, and apply it to issues in public health and health promotion. And I want to suggest that that's problematic. You basically end up with an idea that much routine public health practice is then described as being unethical. And that seems strange. Many of my friends who work in public health, they seem perfectly nice people to me. They're motivated by very familiar and good motives. Why should we think right at the beginning that there's a problem with people who have this idea of focusing upon trying to do something about other people's health? So that was my starting point many years ago, was thinking, is that really the position that we ought to be in? Do we just go through all of public health practice and just dismiss it as being unethical because it's paternalistic? And what I want to do is to suggest to you reasons why we should think about ethical issues more from the population point of view, and how that might then make a difference to us thinking about both public health ethics but also bioethics. So I'm going to show you some slides from the US from the CDC, and I'm just going to click through these really quickly. And these are showing obesity trends amongst US adults. So this isn't being overweight, this is being obese. And we start back in 1985, and as you can see, most of the country, there's no data, but we have two categories, so there's less than 10% and 10 to 14%. So this is on an annual basis, you can just note the changes. So this is 6 years later, we have a new category. This is 10 years later. This is 12 years later, so we have to introduce another category. Sorry, there's something going wrong at the bottom. So here we have another category. And then it's over 30% in the states in the deep red. Okay, so I think one of the things that's interesting about this is the very fact that you can note those changes on an annual basis. That suggests to me that something is rapidly changing. What is it that's going on there? Can we explain this in terms of individuals choosing to adapt particular lifestyles? Maybe we can, but it looks to me, seeing those slides, more like an infectious disease outbreak, the way that it spreads through the population and it deepens. If you look at the similar slides for HIV in the United States, and again, you get a similar kind of pattern. There's a spread, but there are various places around the country where the problem is focused. And I don't know whether there are any similar slides for Mexico, but I use these a lot to demonstrate very quickly this interesting idea about focusing on populations rather than just individuals. So there are all kinds of disputes we could have about this. I'm going to lay those to one side. So some people dispute whether BMI is a suitable tool to use. I think it has its problems, but I don't think disputing about BMI as a tool is going to help really with addressing that particular problem that I just outlined. I'm going to assume as well that obesity is correlated with a number of poor health outcomes, so it increases your risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, some cancers, mental health problems, etc., etc. So I'm just going to assume that for the rest of the talk. Again, some people dispute some of that evidence, but I would argue it's fairly robust. And I'm also assuming that we're talking about a democratic society. And what I mean by that is that when we think about the actions of public health, they have some legitimacy within a democratic society. Because if people in public health were doing things that the majority of people felt were unacceptable, then they would be in trouble, because the politicians who were asking them to do various things would be under pressure. They wouldn't get elected, re-elected, and they would be putting pressure on people working in public health to change their policies. So we're not talking here about totalitarian public health, which again is something that some people seem to have in their minds, as though public health people just wanted to control everybody's life all of the time. So my challenge for somebody who wants to think about something like obesity from the perspective of traditional medical ethics, this narrow idea of public health ethics, focusing particularly upon individual choice and liberty, is how do you explain that pattern? Does it make any sense to think people's wills have got weaker over the last 30 years, and that's the reason for this, or that individuals have chosen to buy into the exciting new obesity lifestyle? It's trendy to become overweight. So I think that there are all kinds of problems that somebody has explaining what's going on here. And there's a tendency to focus upon individual choice and responsibility in that model. And again, that raises some ethical issues, which I'll talk about. So as an alternative, I'll talk a little bit about what I call substantive public health ethics as a way into then trying to think a little bit about how we ought to respond to growing rates of obesity. And the starting point for what I call substantive public health ethics is starting out with the concept of public health itself. So what is public health? That in itself can be disputed, but I'd argue that, and I've argued in a paper written with a friend of mine, Marcel Vervein, that what we ought to do when we think about public health is to notice that we're talking about health, but it's really important to see that the word public performs a number of different roles. So one is a description of what we're interested in. So public health is about the health of a group, of a population, of a society. So you're focused on more than one individual. You're focused on a body of people. So it's public as in the public. The public in Mexico City are a concern for public health. And the second aspect of public is a completely different idea, and again tends to emphasize more the normative, the ethical perspective. So here, attaining such ends often requires collective activities. What I mean by that is that public health often requires individuals to work together to achieve particular aims. And sometimes that's done through groups of individuals voluntarily coming together. In other cases, this is something that we pass over the power to make these kinds of decisions to public health administrators, to the government, because that's the best way of, the most efficient way perhaps, of attaining many of these collective activities. So a good example of this would be something that I've done a lot of work on in the past. Think about vaccination for many routine childhood diseases. Something like measles is perhaps the best example. So you have a highly contagious disease. You can think about it in terms of the individual benefit of every child being vaccinated. That's certainly a good thing. It's useful to protect the individual children. But if you achieve vaccination rates of 95% in the population, you also protect all those individuals who, for whatever reason, can't be vaccinated or aren't vaccinated. So there's an extra population benefit that comes from vaccination programs, some vaccination programs. And people tend to call that herd immunity. I don't like the term for various reasons. I'd rather call it community protection. But I won't go into that here. But you see the idea that really, if I as a parent have a child and I believe that it's really important that we create community protection, herd immunity in the population, there's very little that I can do about it as an individual. I can protect my own child, but how do I attain these collective ends? I have to convince public health authorities and my neighbours and my colleagues to vaccinate their children as well. And then you get these extra benefits. Secondly, in thinking about this more substantive idea of public health, I think what we ought to do is to look at what public health is as a practice. The aims of public health are very different from clinical medicine. So there are many that we could talk about, but I think public health tends to focus on preventing, or if you can't prevent, then reducing harm. So you do epidemiology to determine what harms exist, what causal factors exist within society, and then you intervene to reduce them. Secondly, very importantly, for talking about obesity, there's a concern about not just trying to treat people when they turn up in a doctor's surgery, but to actively promote health, to say these kinds of lifestyles will impact positively or negatively upon your health, and you ought to think about these particular factors. And thirdly, there's a concern about justice considerations. So most of my friends that work in public health have a very strong moral and political imperative. They want to do good, they want to improve the world. And one of the things that a lot of public health work does is identify inequities, inequalities within the population, and then seek to address them. So if there's a particular region of Mexico City where vaccination rates are very low, people in public health want to know about that so that then they could perhaps have a targeted campaign to try and achieve a particular problem there. I just got back a few weeks ago from doing some work in Bangladesh, and there they have real problems with diseases like cholera. And in a country like Bangladesh, public health epidemiology is going on to identify problem places for cholera, and then you can have programs to intervene to try and do something about it. Thirdly, if we think about obesity and many problems in public health, we're dealing with complexity. So you probably can't see this, but you can see all the diagrams. This is supposed to be some kind of explanation for the causal factors for obesity. So we have education, technology, the nature of work, the built environment, healthcare, early life experiences, food production and supply, macroeconomics, so sort of politics, education, the media, and so on. So it's interesting, when I talk to people about obesity and talk about these issues, one response that I've had is just to say, oh, it's all really complicated, we can't do anything. And I think that is an understandable response, but I want to say, well, I don't think we should just despair. You know, can we do something to actually tackle these particular problems? And one of the reasons for thinking about this more substantive idea about public health ethics is that you can link it up with some traditions within public health itself. So there's been some recent discussion in public health about what's called ecological public health, which is basically trying to take account of all of these complexities, rather than just thinking about a simple A causes B kind of idea for causal factors in public health. What we try and do is to map out what the different features are, and then think about policies that can try and address that complexity in turn. So the idea here is to look at human beings as biological, social, economic, and political beings. So my approach to ethics, my suggestions for thinking about substantive public health ethics are to start more with ideas about human beings as being socially embedded creatures. We have to take account of the beliefs and practices that individuals have. We need to focus on the context within which people live, rather than the traditional, I think, medical ethics approach within bioethics, but also that approach to public health ethics. It tends to focus on individuals and leave out the importance that things like relationships or social factors have upon thinking about the individual's choices. The next issue to talk about is that, again, in distinction from this minimal idea of public health ethics, I want to say that when we think about public health as a practice, we can see other kinds of values going on in the work of public health. So it makes sense to me to think that you would expect public health ethics to then take into account the values that we see within public health as a practice. So liberty, ideas about autonomy, are going to be really important. But they're not always going to be the thing which is most important. It's not necessarily going to be the thing that always takes priority. And therefore, it makes no sense to think about ethical issues as having a bias or a presumption in favor of liberty over other considerations. So more and more work in public health ethics is trying to think about what other kinds of values do we see in public health practice or are relevant to thinking about issues in public health, rather than just always focusing upon liberty. There are various reasons to think about this. This goes back to the obesity story. So remember that the minimal public health ethics approach to obesity is going to have to answer the question, why has there been that rapid change that we saw in the CDC slides? And presumably their focus is going to be upon, well, individuals have chosen to act in particular ways. They have the preferences that they do, and we ought to respect those preferences. An alternative is to start asking questions about to what extent we genuinely freely choose all the time. We like to think of ourselves as being autonomous individuals, but aren't we all influenced by the social relationships that we have? And there's been a whole trend in both political, social science and public health work to focus on this, and it's called social network theory. And roughly speaking, the idea would be that the relationships that you have with others directly influence your choices. So two American researchers called Christakis and Fowler, they had a series of papers in the New England Journal of Medicine, one on obesity and one on smoking. And they came up with the same idea, which is that they traced the network of friendship relationships that individuals had with others. And it turns out that in relation to both smoking and obesity, who you are friends with influences your choices. So if you are friends with smokers, it's far more likely that you smoke. If you are friends with people that are overweight or obese, it's far more likely that you are. And what's interesting is that the intensity of the relationship, so if somebody's a close friend, it has far more of an effect than if they're an acquaintance, somebody that you don't see that often. So what this suggests is that the choices that we make, we might think are free choices, but they're actually influenced by our friendship. And there are various other issues to talk about. So are collective responses irrelevant? One of the problems here is that if you are interested in that public, in the collective side of things, and you're approaching things from medical ethics, traditional bioethics, then you might then focus on individuals and say every individual has to consent. But if every individual has to consent to a population-based program, you're going to do nothing, because there's bound to be at least one person that objects to it. So why should we have that as the relevant threshold? Why do we think that we ought to focus upon getting the consent of every single individual, particularly because we know it's going to be impossible to achieve? And lastly, again, going back to the aims of public health, how important is prevention? So, Beecham and Childress's 4 principles, what do they say about prevention? Nothing. So, how should we focus in on thinking about prevention as a priority in the range of health activities that we might want to look at? And what I want to suggest is that there are many kinds of values that can help us here. That if we're thinking about humans as biological and social creatures, and accepting that reality, then we can look and talk in terms of what are the conditions for human flourishing. And that's partly a scientific story in terms of what allows individuals to thrive and develop in the appropriate way, and what causes them to have biological and social problems. So think about children and children's upbringing. There are many factors that people have done research on in terms of children need to be socialized. They need to be, from an early age, interacting with other human beings in an appropriate way. And if they don't, they can have major long-term psychological problems. So think of some of the evidence that comes out of horrific situations where children have been left in orphanages and neglected. There's some very good evidence from Europe, from Romania, from the 1980s and 90s, where there were these huge orphanages where children were just put and they weren't allowed to interact with other human beings. And now that those individuals are adults, they find it very difficult to actually be a member of a society, because they have never learned to properly interact with other human beings. And other kinds of values can be thought about and talked about from the perspective of this substantive public health ethics. It's ideas about solidarity, about social justice, about the goods that we share. So things like that could be clean air, good sanitation, but also things like the fact that if you have confidence that the food that you're going to eat in restaurants or food you're going to buy in the supermarket is healthy, is not going to cause you any medical problems, perhaps because there's inspection or regulations for making sure that that food is good quality, then that's a common good. We would like to live in a society where various protections exist that allow us to live the life that we want to live. And this kind of, a lot of public health work is in the background. It's not visible until something goes wrong. So if there's one particular food product that is contaminated and people that eat that become affected, then that becomes headline news for a few days. People want to know what's happened, what's the problem, why has that come about. But generally, all that kind of routine surveillance activity that public health people are doing, all the inspections and so on, is invisible. But it's all contributing to the kind of common goods which we have in society. So there are various objections to the kinds of things I'm talking about. Paternalism is the big one, but I think things are more complicated than it might be thought in this case. So paternalism is classically defined as being an intervention motivated by wanting to do good for the other person. So if I, say I'm a physician and I'm enrolling my patients in a clinical trial because the drug company is going to give me 1,000 for every individual that I enroll in that trial. That's not paternalism. It might be wrong for all kinds of other reasons, but it's not paternalism. If I enroll my patients in a trial because I believe it's best for them, then that could be paternalism. But just calling something paternalism doesn't end the question. We then need to ask, is it justifiable or not? So, as a parent myself, I'm paternalistic all the time. That's what I think being a caring parent is about. You try and guide and help your children to make the right choices, but sometimes you restrict their choices as well. And you do, as long as you do that from the right kind of motive, that you're doing it not just to annoy them or because you enjoy seeing them suffering, causing them pain, but you're doing it because you think it's for their good, then that is paternalism, but surely it's justified. So I think we need to be careful when we use the term, that it's not just used as a label for all kinds of bad behavior. And in relation to thinking about obesity, there are interesting issues here as well, because many people who are overweight or find it difficult to make the choices that they want to make in relation to their food or their lifestyle, they might actually want help. So they might be arguing that this is actually going to increase my autonomy if you restrict my choices in various ways. So again, the question in relation to paternalism, I think, is a lot more complicated than might be thought at first. Secondly, there's an objection to thinking about public health ethics as being related to public health as a practice, which is that it's an internal practice, that there's a danger that we just, everything that's good, but also everything that's bad about public health is then taken in and used as part of what we think of as being public health ethics. But again, I want to come back to, remember, one of my assumptions here is that we're working in a democratic country and that there is some kind of accountability for public health. So I think that's far less of a problem. Again, public health practice can change over time, and as long as you can take that into account, I don't see any particular problem there. So my conclusions are that it might look as though minimal public health ethics provides the answers, and you could adopt that position if you want. But go back to those CDC slides. If you want to just say it's always liberty that takes priority over everything else, and we can just forget all this stuff about equity and solidarity and so on, it's all just nonsense, nonsense imported from Europe or something, then you need to provide an answer to me about why, causally, you need to explain how that rapid change in society has happened. Is it really due to individual choice? And by contrast, substantive public health ethics is trying to focus public health ethics upon public health itself, trying to explore what is public health doing, what are its aims, what is it seeking to achieve, and how can we think about which of those aims do we want to actually endorse and then see as being important, and what ethical issues relate to those aims, and how can we then incorporate them in our ethics in general. Substantive public health ethics is going to try and look towards other values and capture this complexity, and also look to socially embedded biological and social factors about human beings and take them into account in thinking about our public health ethics. So I think I will stop there and see if you have any comments or questions. Thank you.
Está abierta la presentación del profesor Angus. Siéntase libre de hacerlo en inglés o en español. No, ya está.
The little that I know about the subject you're talking about is obesity. What's happening in Mexico, and I believe it's true in some parts of the United States, we can make a correlation of obesity with poverty and segregation. Obesity has become a disease of poor people. It's not malnutrition anymore. It's another way of malnutrition. It's obesity. I know, for example, in the U.S., if you would look at the distribution that you show in your slides, and you will divide it among soft populations, you will see that Hispanics and African Americans are the main targets for this disease, for obesity. Here in Mexico, what we see is something similar. The poorest areas, or the poorest populations, are the ones at greater risk of having obesity. In that sense, I think that the question of autonomy has to do with, like you say, if I'm going to make an autonomous decision, it has to be an informed decision knowing what's happening with my health. And I think that these people that are at risk are the ones that have the less information. Maybe they're coming into a healthier lifestyle because now they have access to food they didn't have access some years ago. And one thing that people that work in social sciences explain, that someone that went from a very deprived state of food to a state where they have no food available, they tend to overeat. I don't know if that will be the whole explanation, but I think that it has to do with a matter that they're not making an autonomous decision because they don't have all the right information. Somebody once told me that this is something like what happened when the Titanic sank. Who were the people that saved themselves? The people that were in first class. They were the first ones to know that the ship was sinking, and they have access to the lifeboats. Then you have the people on second class. Some of them got the information, and there were still available some lifeboats for them to get on. And then the third, the fourth, and the fifth class, they didn't know that the ship was sinking until they saw the water coming into their rooms. And when they knew that the water was there weren't enough boats for them to get on. And I think that something similar is happening with obesity. In addition, that now having a healthy lifestyle costs money. It's cheaper to have an unhealthy lifestyle than to have a healthy one. Healthier foods tend to be more expensive. For example, here in Mexico, it's cheaper for a low-income family to buy a soft drink with lots of sugar than to buy a liter of milk. So they buy the soft drink instead of buying the milk. Plus, they're bombarded through the media that drinking a soft drink gives you some kind of status. Milk doesn't.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things that I think also distributive justice means of having all this information, having all the good things going to all the classes of society. And I think the lower classes, where the low-income people are, they don't have access to information, they don't have access to a lot of things. So I don't think it will be a matter of educating, but also while you're educating, you need to better the standards of living of these people, so they will, with this elevation of standards of living, a healthier lifestyle will come in.
Okay, so there's a lot in what you just said. I think from the traditional million approach to bioethics, there will be a tendency to focus on education. So the explanation for why inequalities in society exist is one to do with education. So people in poorer areas have less access to information, and therefore they don't respond to that information, they eat the wrong things. But the other element of what you're saying is more the kinds of things that I think I'm interested in pointing to, which are about the inequalities that exist in society already, which mean that if you had a public health campaign that was only about providing information, I don't think it would have the impact. So you need to think about social justice effectively, and a focus on social justice as being, and equity as being principles that ought to be at the heart of bioethics. That's more substantive public health ethics. And some of that relates to just noticing the inequalities that exist in society and trying to do something about it. But some of it relates also to the kinds of interventions that we might be talking about that can't always be done by the individual. So you mentioned advertising. One of the things that I think has led to this rapid expansion of obesity in the US and in Mexico and in the UK, in the UK, by the way, we're third. We get the bronze medal in relation to obesity, so we're just behind Mexico. So, you know, one of the things that's important to think about is what's caused that. And I would argue a lot of it is to do with advertising, the food industry, targeting particular people, producing very, very cheap, but also very bad food. And if you're poor, it does make sense to, you're on a tight budget, it's easy to find this food, you know, it's called fast food because it's easily available, it's cheap, and it also has biological sort of satisfaction built into it. You know, it's high sugar, high salt, high fat. These are all things that our bodies love, and you're almost priming people. So if you are more affluent and you're able to think more and about what you eat and the foods that you consume, or you can buy other products, you can have gym membership, or you've got time and leisure time to do some activity that provides exercise and so on, then you're right, there's all of that, those social conditions have to be built in. But notice on the minimal public health ethics and a lot of medical ethics, if you just say it's always liberty that does the work, then you have some real problems. So a good example of this kind of argument was a couple of years ago there was a paper in the American Journal of Bioethics, I don't know whether anybody saw, by somebody called David Resnick, and he was arguing that it was everybody's right to consume trans fat in food, and this is a pure kind of minimal bioethics, traditional bioethics type argument. It was a pure liberty argument, that if food was 3 cents cheaper and that contained trans fat, even though we know trans fat is dangerous and has no positive benefits at all, but it does make some foods marginally cheaper. He was arguing that it should be people's free choice to do that. And he was opposed to the New York City regulations that said that no products containing trans fat could be sold in New York. So that's a straight conflict between, I wrote a response to a friend of mine to that, as did many other people, but there's a straight conflict between the minimal public health ethics approach, which says liberty is the dominant principle, and a more substantive idea that's going to say, what's the best evidence about harm? What's the benefit from trans fat? There is none. We know that there's harm. We can take that out of these products. People won't even notice, but we know that we will improve their health by doing it. So thinking about the nature of the collective interventions as well. Think about the definition of public health that I gave. This second element, the more political and social element of acting collectively together, very often through something like regulations or addressing background inequalities in relation to social conditions. That's, I would argue, the key way to tackle these particular problems. It's great if you can have information as well, but it's very interesting if you look at the health promotion literature, information and even programs that aim to change people's behavior, they tend to work in the short time. But if you go back 6 months after the program's ended, people are not just back to where they were, they tend to be worse than they were when the program started. So I didn't have time to go into it, but I'd be a skeptic because of the empirical evidence about just focusing upon information.
It's like, I'm going to give information about what you should do,
Yes.
knowing that you have no means to do it.
Right. So there's a responsibility for society, for the government, to not just do that. And it's a very common message that you get, particularly from the United States, where they hold individual liberty to be so important. That's one reason why they're perhaps less interested in addressing considerations to do with justice, because of the priority that they give to the actual value of liberty.
Do you mind if we give the word?
I want to make a question. How do you think that the values of the bioethics can be incorporated in the government agenda to construct more complete policies? Because I think that now in this moment the policymakers doesn't take in account the bioethics to construct a very more stringent policies. I think that the bioethics element is very important in the public policy.
No, I agree, and so my background is in philosophy, very theoretical and so on, but some of the things that I'm most proud of in my life are about the policy work that I've done, working with people in different governments, working on committees to try and change things. So I want to change the world, and it's sometimes frustrating when you look at government policies where the issues that they're looking at raise ethical issues, bioethics issues, and they haven't taken those into account. So I think there's going to be no easy solution. It's not something you can instantly overnight change, but I think, I've got the experience just in the last 2 days. There's a huge amount of interest in the work of the Commission and bioethics in general amongst people that work in government and universities and so on, and it's making sure that that profile is raised, and you can do everything like writing articles in popular newspapers or writing papers with people who work in government, or having some easy access to swap between people working in universities and in government, so that you get that kind of an exchange. And it's one concern that I have about a lot of government policies is that they tend to focus on a narrow range of values. So in the UK, there's this tendency to focus on liberty, but also make judgments in terms of economics. So health economics, for example, has a huge amount of power when it comes to thinking about which policies to introduce. I think cost is a really important consideration, but there are other things as well, and sometimes it's the right thing to do to spend a little bit more on a particular product because it has other kinds of benefits. So even cost effectiveness analysis, you can change it so that politicians, policymakers expand the range of values that they take into account in the work that they do. But I'm afraid that there's no easy way to do it. It's a long-term project. But I think here in Mexico, it seems to me you're in a really good position because of the status of the commission here. That gives you access then to people working in health And you, I would hope, are able to then establish a conversation and make sure that they don't see it as just being criticism of what they're doing, that there's a dialogue there, that there's discussion, and you have something to contribute. Bioethics has something to contribute.
From this side, so any comments? Yes.
My English is not very good. I think
It's better than my
there are two values very important. That is the common goods and the autonomy. I think that in the political publics, the common goods is the value more important. And finally, the autonomy is only for decision in every, I don't know, for every people. I think that the political public only is the common goods, and the autonomy of people it's relevant, but finally you can decide for the common. So what do you think about the good relation or good, because the one risk is the paternalism, you say, and the paternalism decide for the common goods.
Yeah.
So what is the, I don't know, interrelation, or how you can make the good combination with the autonomy? I can see how the politics public may use this value.
I think your question is about how we combine different kinds of values, and perhaps the best way to talk about this is to think of an example. So let's assume that you, as a policymaker, somebody in the Ministry of Health, thinks that it's a good idea to try and get Mexicans to walk around more, to exercise more. Now, you are thinking that's a common good. That would be good for maybe you can reduce some healthcare costs as well if people are exercising more and they're healthier. But how do you go about that? Again, you could just provide information and say, please walk around more, do more exercise. Again, I'm skeptical that that's going to work. But governments are powerful. There are all kinds of things that they could do. And sometimes they do things for one reason, and then it has some effect that they hadn't thought about in advance. So think about the subsidies on fuel that you have here, which means that gas is very cheap. So that encourages people to own cars, and then they are less likely to use public transport, which means that they're less likely to walk to their train station or to their bus stop at either end. So by encouraging people to own cars, one of the effects is that people exercise less. So again, think about the CDC slides. There are all kinds of complex things going on there about that rapid increase. But one is, everything about our lives has changed so quickly. Now I spend most of my days sat at my desk in front of my computer, whereas in the past I might have been working in the fields or doing some physical activity, working in a factory, doing something physical all day long. But maybe I consume the same amount of calories, but I'm just sitting there. The only thing that moves is my finger on the mouse, clicking them. So I have a very fit finger, but the rest of me is not so good. So how do you encourage people to exercise more? It's about thinking about policies to do with agriculture, food production, transportation, the design of cities as well. So again, as an individual, perhaps I want to exercise more. So I'm a really keen cyclist, and I moved house 2 years ago from a different city, and the city I used to live in was built, really all the roads were built in the 1970s, and they were built for cars. And to cycle around there was literally to take your life in your hands. Whereas now I live in a different city, and there's more provision for cycling. So it's safe to cycle because there are separate cycle lanes. So I cycle part of the way to work and then get the train. But me as an individual, I can't create a cycle lane. It requires enough people to campaign against the government, and the government to say, yes, this is really good because people will exercise more, and that's good for everybody. It's good for individuals, and it's also good for the population. So I think that's a good example of how in Mexico you could do something to, of course, gas prices would then go up and people would complain, and everything would be at a higher price as a result because things need to be transported around. So there will be some point where you think about the cost and balances of policies, but it's the same in the UK. Politicians will get elected if they say they're going to reduce the taxation on gas because people love their cars, they love the freedom that comes with them, but we need to think about what the consequences are when we're deliberately encouraging people to adopt a particular lifestyle. Another example would be, there's a really interesting study done in Canada. I lived in Toronto for 2 years, and it was a study looking at the fitness levels of individuals that worked in different car factories. One car factory was Ford, a US company, one was Toyota, a Japanese company. The Japanese company had a policy of everybody had access to a gym at work, they were encouraged to take more breaks. In lunchtime they were encouraged to walk around and to exercise and to socialize. And the rates of obesity were half in the Toyota factory that they were in the Ford factory. So organizations can also do a lot for their workers, the people that work in a place, to encourage them to live healthy lives.
Well,
there is
the last question, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Well, it's a comment of Angus. Well, she said that obesity is a problem that requires individual response, but it also requires a government that protects vulnerable groups, like children or really poor people, so they can choose what they want. And finally, she thinks that the solution comes with a responsibility principle, that Hans Jonas principle. So that is that kind of.
Okay, yes, good comments. So I think of obesity and other work in public health as very importantly suggesting that governments do have responsibilities, and it's important, again, the narrow focus just upon liberty and on autonomy means that you might hold that the state has no role in thinking about these things. I think that the state has a responsibility. Do you want to stop or come back on? The state has a responsibility to look after different populations. So children are a very good example. So given the evidence that we have that preventing obesity is something that we can achieve, whereas treating obesity is something that we can't, except for when somebody becomes really, really seriously obese. There's some evidence that surgery is effective. But for the average person, that's not going to be an option. So in relation to children, because children have the classic examples of, remember I was talking about the social contacts and the choices that we have that are shaped by others. Children's choices are shaped by their upbringing, by the people who live around them. So yesterday I was talking about smoking. There's a similar kind of issue. We have very good evidence that if you were a child brought up in a family of smokers, you are far more likely to smoke. If you're brought up in a family of non-smokers, you're less likely to smoke. So there's an influence there upon the choices that a child has once they become an adult about the way that they're brought up. So thinking about obesity, thinking about the responsibility that both parents and schools and society as a whole has towards children could mean that we intervene more and we have more policies to try and help children to exercise more and eat the right things, and also address the background social inequalities that are one of the causes here. So I think governments do have responsibilities, and they have more responsibilities than merely trying to maximize the amount of liberty that individuals have, which means that we need to think about more than just this traditional medical ethics, traditional kind of narrow idea about public health ethics.
Well, if you don't mind, we could stop here, and we would like to thank Professor Dawson. We know that this is a key topic that the Mexican Council of Bioethics has to deal with it. I think that we have to set up a seminar in order to take these concepts and this presentation in order to build up a policy to present it and to promote it. I think that the key words are complexity and responsibility. But I think it is everybody's business. I learned that when I went to do my studies in UK, but something which strikes me is that where we were 10 years ago, I mean the public health system, the government, the society. I think that we don't have an answer, but I would say thank you, Angus, for this beautiful presentation, and this presentation, I think, will be not only translated in a proper way, but also we are going to publish it in our magazine in order to promote it, and we will send it to the public health people. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for all of you that you were here to listen to this terrific presentation. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming along, and if anybody's interested, I co-edit a journal called Public Health Ethics, and I have a leaflet here, so please help yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you.